Hello, my name is Saremy, and today I'm going to be showing you how to sew a camp collar shirt from start to finish. And I'll give you tips and tricks along the way if you're doing things a little differently than me, whether you have a yoke or you don't, or you have a facing that's separate or built on. I'll cover you all along the way. I'm going to show you how to do a mitered hem with a vent and a French seam at the end. Let's get to it. Here's a quick visual of the difference between a button-up shirt and a camp shirt. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy. There's going to be lots of little subtle nuances between these things that people will dispute over. I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So you can see on the button-up shirt, it's clearly different than the camp shirt. They do seem to get a little mixed up sometimes, and the distinctive quality for these, in my opinion, is the collar and the button front opening, because the camp shirt has a collar without a collar stand, and you can see that this has the collar stand here underneath, and the pattern pieces, like this is the collar and the collar stand, whereas the camp collar only has the collar itself, and there's going to be a top and an under collar. I'm just going over the basic shapes of the collars. And now the other thing is how they're sewn in. The button-up shirt and the camp shirt both do not have back neck facings, but the camp shirt does have a front facing, and it looks like this guy here. So this is the button front opening, and then this goes along the front neck. And the button-up shirt usually has some sort of button placket that's straight like this one here. And there's a lot of variations on this. Sometimes they're built onto the shirt, sometimes they're separate, sometimes they have a tuck. So there's lots of different versions of this. I'm just giving you kind of a basic overview. The difference between them, like in a bulleted list: button-up shirt, collar and collar stand; camp shirt, only a collar. They can both be worn buttoned all the way to the top, or the top button can be left open, so they do share that quality, meaning these both have convertible collars. The button placket and the button facing are different. The button-up shirt almost always has a back yoke. The camp shirt traditionally doesn't, but I like to add one because I find it to be a fun element to play with fabric. Button-up shirts will have long sleeves with cuffs and some sort of placket at the cuff, and the camp shirt's usually short-sleeved. And then the last detail would be the hem difference. The button-up shirt has a shirt tail hem for tucking, whereas the camp shirt is intended to never be tucked, and it would have a straight hem with a side vent here. So these are the basic differences between these two, and if you're looking for a tutorial on how to sew a button-up shirt, I have a bunch of videos linked in the description for each of the skills that you need to be able to sew one. And if you're here to sew a camp shirt, let's start sewing. For our camp collar shirt today, I'm going to be using a shirt with a yoke, a facing here. I'm going to bias finish this facing. It has pockets on the front. I'm going to be sewing this with French seams, and I'm going to be using a vent at the bottom with a mitered hem corner. It's going to be a continuous stitch for this hem finish. I'm going to stitch my facing down, but you don't have to. But this means I'm going to have a nice clean look all the way around without any back tacks, except at the beginning and the end. Now, if you're sewing yours with a serger or a zigzag, you can follow right along. If you want to use a flat felled finish for your armhole and side seam, I tell you when to go do that. And all the rest of it, you can pick and choose what you're using for your camp collar shirt, no matter what pattern you're using. My fabric today is a quilting cotton in a fun camping print. Let's go over our pieces and put them in order of how we're going to sew them. So we're going to start from the last item first. So I have my sleeves here, and we're going to put those at the bottom of our bin. Then I'm going to put in my collar. I've already interfaced my top collar. I'm using sew-in interfacing, so that's why it looks like that. And then here's my under collar. Next we have our yoke, if you're using it, and our lower back. But if you're not using a yoke, you'll just have your backs, and we'll put those in next. And I'm putting a hanging loop and my label right there, since I'm going to sew mine to the yoke, but you can sew yours to the next seam, whatever you like. Next we have the facings. And I've already interfaced my facings, and I'm also going to bias finish the edge, but if you want to use a serger or zigzag, that works too. Here's my bias binding. And then lastly, I have my pockets and my fronts, and they're going to go on top since that's our first step. So now we have our pieces in order, and we can pull them out of the bin as we go. Our first step is to make our pieces whole, like you do with any garment project. So first we're going to add our pockets or pocket to our fronts. I already have my pocket markings marked here with some pins. My pocket hems are pressed and ready to go according to the hem allowance for this pattern piece. And we're going to now sew our pockets. So let's do our hems. I've made sure my pocket is symmetrical, and now we're going to attach one. I always start upside down with the shirt, and I'm going to center this over my pins. For me, I'm going to stitch down my facing here. I'm going to be a little bit aware of how close I am over here, and I would much rather err on sliding it over so that I have plenty of room to stitch my facing down and I don't go across the corner. Make sure it's parallel to your center front. Now we're going to start at the hem, go up towards the top edge and a little slightly inward so that we can create a little triangle for some strength for use. I will back stitch there, and we'll go up, and then we'll go across to this edge here. I usually do 1 to 2 stitches depending, what you want, and then we'll go straight down. My pocket has a little point today. And I always like to tuck in these corners. I didn't show you on the first one, but I sort of bend it back a little bit. And basically this top edge is being lined up to this fold line here. And that just keeps all those raw edges tucked in there. Now we're going to go up to the top, and we're going to go toward the middle of the pocket, the same number of stitches we did over here, and then back down to the hem. There we go, and now we'll repeat for the other pocket. All right, our 2 pockets are applied, and now we're going to move on to our next step. Let's prepare our facings for when we're ready to attach our collar to the neckline. If you haven't already interfaced your facings, I would do so now. And you're going to want to finish this outer edge here, all down the front here. And I also suggest finishing this edge here. Now you can use a zigzag, an overlock, a serger. I'm going to use a bias finish today, a Hong Kong finish. And if you want a detailed tutorial for how to do that, it's linked in the description. I'll just go over it quickly here. And the reason I say to finish this edge here is that this edge isn't going to be able to be tucked into the shoulder seam. So you're going to want some sort of finish so it won't fray. For my bias finish, I'm using a piece of fabric that's cut on the bias, and it's 1 1/4 inches wide. And I'm going to start at the neck edge, go across the shoulder and down, just because I just want the whole thing finished at once. I don't mind rounding this corner. And when I go around the corner here, I'll do 1 diagonal stitch and then turn again and go now along the edge. I'm sewing this at about 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I will be trimming later. And we're going to trim it flush. This is just the way I really like finishing my facings lately. I like adding a little pop of color or contrast fabric inside, and it really does make a nice finish that lasts a long time. But if you're using a super lightweight fabric for your camp shirt, then I would recommend doing something lightweight as well. And if your shirt's going to be sheer or in any way see-through, you're not going to want to do a contrast. So I'm going to trim this little corner right here, round it like this. And now I'm going to trim along this edge so that it's a little under that 1/4 inch seam allowance. This just depends on how wide you want this finish to be. There's not really a wrong answer there. You can make it as wide as you want. It just depends on the width of your bias and your seam allowance. And I want something pretty narrow and tidy looking. Now I'm going to press this in 2 steps. I'm first going to press it flat with the seam allowance pressed this way. The seam allowance is always going to be pressed flat. We're never going to bend it. So we're going to press this bias towards the seam allowance, and then again we're going to wrap it around that seam allowance, and we'll get a nice tidy little narrow strip just like this. Now if you want to trim down your bias so that it's not going to be a lot hanging out in there, you can do this before or after we stitch it down. It's looking like this. This little corner will be a little fussy to press if you did this. And it looks a little bit like this on the back side. You can see it's kind of rumpled there. That's okay with me. So now we're going to stitch in the ditch. And what this means is we're going to try and stitch right there in the seam that we just sewed. Now you can sew onto the bias or onto the facing or in the ditch, it doesn't matter. This isn't going to be visible to the world. I would just pick something that's easy to do and keeps you consistent. There we go. Our facings are ready for the collar and the front. Let's attach our label, whether you're making the yoke version or the not yoke version. I think it's always a good idea to do this ahead of time so you don't forget later. So if you're not doing the yoke version, I would just put your label right here at the back neck on the inside and just tack it on there inside the seam allowance. I have a contrast inner yoke and I'm doing the yoke version. So I'm going to attach my label right here just because I like it a little better down there, and it gives me the opportunity to add a hanging loop. And if you want a hanging loop at the neckline, you can do the same thing alongside your label. I found that this needs to be a lot shorter than I always think it needs to be. This one here is a little over 2 inches long, about 2 1/4, and I like to press it in a way where I sort of fold it in thirds. This way it can lay flat in the shirt, and I try to fold it so that it's going to be the same width of whatever I'm stitching down here. So I'm going to press this so that it stays like this, and then I'm going to sew part of my label first and then slip it under there. I found the center of my yoke, and sometimes I will center what I'm stitching there, or I'll put it slightly higher, maybe resting the bottom of it on the center line. It's just something to use as a guide. So now I'm going to start sewing my patch on here. Make sure I tuck in my little corners here. There we go. All right, now my yoke is ready to use. So let's grab our lower back. And if you're using a lower back and yoke, you might have a pleat along the top edge of the lower back. You might have a pleat at each end of the seam or right there in the middle. You can do whatever yours has. Mine's out here along the shoulder blade. So I'm going to pleat those first and stitch them in the seam allowance. I try and make sure my pleat is perpendicular to the seam. And I'm going to stabilize the pleat a little bit lower to keep it from splaying out. Okay, now my lower back is ready. I'm going to put my outer yoke right sides together to my lower back, and my inner yoke right sides together to the wrong side of the lower back, like a sandwich. And now we'll sew these 3 together along this back seam. All right, now we're going to press our yokes both up. And I try and do these so that they're both nice and flat on the inside and on the outside. And then we're going to top stitch this seam. There we go. Now I'm going to top stitch this seam from the right side. And I make sure that this yoke doesn't slip past the seam or blump over it. All right, now our back is ready for the fronts. Now, if you're doing a non-yoked version, you can put your fronts to your back, sewing your shoulders together, and then finish that seam allowance. And then you can skip to the next section. If you're sewing your fronts to your back and you have a yoke, you can do it this way, or you can use the burrito method. This way, I'm going to put one front lined up to the back, right sides together. I'm going to pick up this top layer, and I'm just going to arrange the end here. And now I'm going to take this yoke, and I'm going to flip it so that it's right sides together. I only line up for the first inch or so, and then I get it under the presser foot at the seam line and start sewing for a bit. Now I take a break and I arrange everything. I put the bottom layer nice and flat, which is the outer back, the front on top, and these 2 layers will be very easy to line up. Now all I need to do is sort of scrunch the shirt in here as I sew this shoulder seam together. And make sure that you catch all 3 layers, and now we just pull it out and it's done. And we'll repeat for this side. This side will be lining up the neck edge. So I have my front, here's my back, and my front, right sides together. I pick up the top layer, line it up for an inch or so. And now I take this yoke and I put it right sides together. And again, I just line it up for a little bit, just enough to get the sewing started. And now we take a break and rearrange everything. Again, the bottom 2 layers will be very easy to stay lined up. And then we're going to just scrunch the shirt up as we line up the inner yoke to the top edge here, to the shoulder edge. It'll look a little messy at first, but then you can just pull it apart, and there you go, you're done. All right, now we have our backs to our fronts, and I'm going to top stitch my yoke seam here after I press it. There we go. The collar is up next. We're going to take our top collar, which is the one that's interfaced, and we're going to lay it right sides together to our under collar. If you don't have a separate under collar piece that's different from your top collar, you don't have to worry about what I'm going to say next. If you do have a separate pattern piece for your under collar, it's going to be slightly smaller in a few ways. So you just want to keep that outer edge lined up the best you can, and you want to pull the under collar to match it. And that's going to help pull the under collar under the top collar so that it doesn't show to the right side. Now sew it at your seam allowance. Now I'm going to trim down a little bit of this collar point here, but I'm not going to lop it off completely. And then I'm going to trim a little bit of my interfacing off here. And I do the same thing over here. And now we're going to turn this right side out. I'm going to fold this edge here toward the under collar here. So I'm going to fold along the short edge here and along the top edge here toward the under collar. And now I'm going to hold on to that and turn it right side out. You can do this however you like, whatever method works for you. It's a little awkward with the angle of that point. It doesn't work as great as it does on squarer points. All right, now I'm going to press this. I'm going to do this in a couple of steps. I'm going to press, this is the under collar sitting here, and it wants to sort of flop like this and keep the seam allowance pressed that way away from the top collar, and that's great. We want that. So we're going to press this first flat like this, and then we're going to line up our cut edge here and press it flat. And what we're going for is seeing a tiny bit of our top collar peeking up above our under collar so that we know that when we're wearing it, we won't see that under collar peeking out. Here's the result. So this is my under collar showing here, and you can see a tiny bit of my top collar peeking up along this outer edge. Now you want to finesse any of your corners here, make them look nice. Now if you want to top stitch your collar, now is the time, or you can understitch it if you like. There we go. We're ready to attach our collar and our facing to our shirt. Now, if you have a built-on facing, that works too. You're going to skip the first step where I'm attaching the facing along the center front. Let's open up our shirt, and we're going to put our facing right sides together along the front here, and we're just going to sew it at our seam allowance to attach it. The first thing I like to do at this stage is to make sure my fronts are going to match, especially at the seam line. This will save us some trouble later on, make it a little easier. So I suggest matching it from the neck down and just seeing where you're at. All right, we look good to go. Your front is starting to look a lot like this. If you have a built-on facing, ours is starting to resemble yours. And if you have the sewn-on facing and you want to understitch the facing, now is the time to do that. If you plan on top stitching the edge at the very end, you can wait till later to do that. So I'm going to press my seam allowances towards the facing, which I've already done, and I'm going to sew on the facing next to the seam with the seam allowances pressed toward it. All right, now we're ready for our collar. You need to make sure that you have your center front notch right here. This is where the collar starts and stops going around the neckline. I sew my camp collars a little differently than the traditional way. I've come up with my own method because I didn't really like how the shoulder notch was always leaving a bit of a raw edge there. I'm sure I didn't invent this, but if you want to sew it the way I like to sew it, you can do so, or you can do it according to the instructions of your pattern. I have my collar right side up, so this is the top collar. This is the under collar. And I'm gonna line up the shoulder notch to the shoulder seam or the shoulder notch, whatever you have. I'm gonna fold the facing along the edge there at the fold line or where it's seamed together. And we're going to place the front of the collar, which is this short end here, right along that notch. And I like to line it kind of straight down to make sure that it's not going to pull away, and I pin it kind of low like this. Now we're about to sew the facing, the neckline, and the collar all together as a sandwich. And in traditional instructions, you do this all the way up to the shoulder notch. We're going to stop before that. That's kind of critical if you don't want that little raw edge of the clip showing. So we're going to sew this, and I'm going to stop about this far away from the end. So we're sewing all the layers, but we're gonna stop about 1.5 inches away from the end of the facing. So I'm folding it right here along that edge where the facing was attached, or your fold line for your facing. We're lining it up along the neckline here. I already have one pin in there holding my collar. And if your seam allowance is larger than 1/4 inch or 3/8, which is about 1 centimeter, I highly recommend you trimming down all of the seam allowances along this edge. So that would be your facing along the neck, your collar edges, and your neckline down to 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch. It's a lot easier to sew on the seam line accurately and have everything line up if the seam allowance is on the narrower side. Mine today is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. So we're just gonna line this up. And while I'm lining up all the edges, I'm not going to sew all the way to the end. So I'll make a little mark here about where I plan to stop, right there. All right, now we're going to sew up to that orange line. We're making sure all the raw edges are lining up to each other. Don't let some of them hang past the others. Try and get all these raw edges lined up and sew right on the seam line of that you have. And just keep adjusting as you go around the curve. The collar is flat and straight, but the neckline isn't, so you need to continually adjust. And stay right on that seam line. Here I am at my orange mark. I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to remove all my pins. Now we're going to put in the clip, and we're going to put it only right here where we stopped sewing. You can get pretty close. I say just inside the seam, and I'm just to the right of where that stitching ended. Now if you want to trim down this section here between this clip I just made and the center front, you can do so. There's no need to clip the curve at all because these seam allowances are going to stay straight. So now I'm going to clip this curve a little bit. Sometimes you'll get a better curve if you just trim it down close rather than clipping into the curve like I'm doing now. Lately I've been sewing more of my curves where I just trim it close rather than clipping in because I get a smoother curve. But I just forgot. All right, we're going to do the other side now. So again, we're lining our collar up to the center front notch there. That would be the line where the buttons and buttonholes are going to be sewn. All right, now we're going to sew this side just to that orange mark. You can see I got that little tuck, and it's because I just didn't start arranging my under layer there to curve around like I mentioned earlier. So I just undo that little tiny tuck and we'll re-sew it. Easy peasy. Now we're going to trim down the neckline here just to that point. And we're going to clip up to the stitching line. All right, so all of this is still loose. We haven't attached anything between those two orange marks that I made. So now what we can do is we're going to finish sewing this little section here, but we're going to pick up the collar, separate them. If you stitch these together, you're just going to have to take it out for a little bit. I'm going to open it up. So this is my collar right here. This is my shirt, and this is my facing. And we're going to separate this. I'm just going to sew the facing to the collar, and I like to do it like this, where I just separate it out and then sew up to it, and we're sewing it at the same seam allowance line. And this way, if I do it on the inside, I can see exactly where to stop. And I try and line it up right to the same spot. Remember, this edge hasn't been trimmed, this one has, so it might be a little confusing and look different. All right, and then here, same thing. If I do it on the inside also, I won't catch anything else. I can see my stitch from the end of that other seam. And we're going right up to it. And now we're going to do the same thing, but for the collar to the neckline. So separate it out, and we're going to sew all the way from that stopping point across the entire back neckline here, lining up our shoulder seams and our center back. So make sure your label is in if you want one. You can see I'm just bending this under layer around as I go around the curve so I don't get any of those tucks. We'll peel the collar apart here as we approach the end. Make sure we're not straining it and that we sew right up to where that stitch line is. So now we have 3 stops right in the same spot. All right, now it's looking like this. We have 1 step left and it's going to be really easy to do. Now you don't need to clip into this curve. You can trim it down if you like, but you don't need to. This seam allowance is going to stay up into the collar, so it doesn't need to splay apart. But if you find that your collar's a really narrow collar or it's a really tight circle, you might want to trim it down just a little bit to make sure it's flexible enough. I'm just going to trim it down so it's a nice, even, clean edge. And I'm only doing the neckline of the shirt and the under collar. We're leaving the top collar alone right now. We need the full seam allowance there. Don't trim any of that off. Doing a last minute inspection of my neck seam, make sure I don't have any other tucks. It's looking good. All right, so now our last step for this collar is we're gonna fold under the edge and top stitch it down. Now this top stitching won't be seen by anybody because it's right up against the neck and we're doing it on the top layer, so if someone does, it's on the good side that they're gonna see it. So what I like to do first to make this really easy and make sure that I don't get the collar torqued at all is I'm gonna put a line of pins down the middle, just sort of parallel to this outer edge. This just makes it easier and faster and more accurate later on when I'm doing the ironing and pinning of the neckline. All right, now I'm gonna start here at the center back and turn that under, and I just turn it under so the fold goes just past the seam that I can see. And make sure also you gave your collar a nice good tug here along this edge. You can press it as well. That's always really great. And now we'll put some pins here. And I'm gonna start at my landmark. So I'm gonna start at the center back and then I'm gonna go to the shoulder. Now right here where we put this clip, all of this goes into the collar. Get rid of this thread here. So fold this in, be really forceful of that. Get it all in there and line it up like that. Give this all a nice good tug and then pin that in like that. And you'll kind of see there's a slight little like a little dimple that happens here, and that's totally normal. You won't see it on this side. All right, and we'll do this one over here. Make sure all these threads are inside. Bend it right there at that clip. I'm gonna get rid of this thread here and this thread. And you see I sort of shape the neckline, like put it into the curve that it's gonna be. Push all of that up into the collar and then pin it down. And now we just have the few places in between here. Get all those threads in there or get rid of them. Make your fold just past the seam line so it looks nice and we cover it up. Our last step now is we're going to sew from beginning to end right there from the spot where we did our clip. And we're going to do this from the top collar side and we're sewing on the collar. So go all the way to that edge there, right where that little dimple is happening. Remember, nobody's going to see this. This is against the back of the neck. This is the inside of the garment. It's not going to be seen. And if you feel like your collar's kind of ooching a little bit, just use your awl and sort of push it into place there. And again, you want to shape the neckline, keep the curve, otherwise you can get little bits of tucks on the other side because it's trying to bend. All right, we're back at the beginning. Let's take out all of our pins. All right, let's see how it looks. All right, we mostly fell on top of the collar, but in places we might not have. See, it's off the collar here, and we're on the collar here. That's no big deal. The collar folds over just like this, and all we see is our outer collar edge. All right, so now let's just take a couple minutes to make sure everything's turned right side out and it looks good. Okay, that's looking really nice. So now we have our flapping facing here at the shoulder here. And if it's reaching far enough, you can pin this down. And you can catch the facing in the seam or using your current top stitch there, or you can use some hand sewing stitches to stitch this right here to the inner yoke or the shoulder seam allowances. You can see this one comes up much higher. So I like to make sure that from the right side, everything looks like it's behaving. I put the collar kind of up, I put the neckline into its curve, and I make sure the facing's not pulling unnecessarily along this facing edge right here on the inside. And then if I feel like it's nice and flat, then I'm going to secure the top edge of the facing in this shoulder seam here. Just like this. Now you can see why I like that to be nice and finished. All right, so let's give this all a good press. And now we're going to check the length of our center front one more time. I like to pull on each layer equally, but sometimes I can tell that one side's getting pulled more than the other. So I will check this a few times, and usually what I'll do is I'll pin it up here to make sure, and make sure that we have both of our center fronts are matching. And then I'll trim it up if I need to, like this side needs a little bit of trimming right here on the facing. And the rest of it looks pretty good. All right, we only have our sleeves and our hems left, and I'm going to show you a fun way to hem your shirt so you can do it in one continuous stitch with the vent. I'm also going to be using French seams, so if you want to follow along using French seams, go for it. Otherwise, you can just sew right sides together, finish your edge however you like. And if you'd like instructions on how to put a sleeve on a shirt using flat-felled seams or using a flat-felled seam with a side seam and the little vent on the side, I have 2 tutorials for you in the description. All right, to start off my French seams, I'm going to do a French seam, side seam, and I do have a vent down here, so I'll show you how I would do a side seam with a French seam and the vent. My vent looks like this. It has a little extension here, which makes it a little easier to be able to hem it. The extension sticks out about a 1/2 inch away from the cut edge. All right, so we're going to sew this wrong sides together. I have 5/8 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to use a 1/4 inch. And then when I get to the top of the vent here, it just depends on where you want it to end. And I'm going to sew my seam and curve it to where it meets the full seam allowance, the 5/8 of an inch. So about right there, so you can see I made kind of a J right here. And now I'm going to cut up to that end of that J at kind of an angle there. And then I'll need to trim this seam allowance here, especially this little wide bit right here. We need to trim that really close. That one for sure needs to be pretty close. And then the rest of it, you can just trim it the way you would for a French seam. All right, now we're going to press it really good. I'm going to open it up, press the seam allowance one direction, it doesn't matter which way, and especially press that little curve the best I can. And just let these sort of flop around. If you want to start pressing those, they're going to get pressed to the inside like this, right at that point. Okay, I've pressed my seam one direction, and now I'm going to turn this right sides together. I'm going to press it again. I'm going to press it so that it's folded right along this seam. And you can see I sort of curved that little edge there where we ended. And we're going to fold this right sides together just like this, right on the edge of that seam there. Now this time when we sew our seam, we're gonna use the remaining seam allowance, and we're making a straight line for the end of that seam right there. So we're basically straightening it out. Let me draw you a line. So now with this seam here, we're sewing right sides together, and we're going to use up the rest of our seam allowance that we have left. And we're going to sew along here parallel to the edge, and we're going to go straight down to the end of that seam. And I drew an orange line right where I'm going to sew. So it might be at an angle here, but remember, we took a larger seam allowance there. So we're going to go straight to the point. Now it's really important to check to make sure you got all of the seam in there. Sometimes with that little curve, we're getting so close and it's so narrow, a little bit's gonna peek through. So you gotta be really careful. Sometimes sewing a little further away will be better. All right, and now we're gonna repeat for our other side seam, and then we're gonna put our sleeves on. We finally get to give some attention to our sleeves. So since I'm French seaming mine, I'm going to sew the underarm seam first, wrong sides together, and then we'll trim, press, turn it right side out, and finish the last seam. And if you're overlocking or zigzagging, you can sew this right sides together and finish your seam allowance. I'm easing my sleeves in today. If you don't need to ease in your sleeves, you can skip this step. I'm gonna add an easing stitch just inside my seam line, my full seam line. I'm going to pull on my easing stitch to sort of draw it up a little bit. I'm going to turn my sleeve right side out. And when I'm doing French seams with a sleeve onto a shirt, I like to press the underarm seam toward the front of the sleeve. That's just so that I can offset the thickness here at the juncture of the underarm and the sleeve. All right, I've turned my shirt right side out. Here's my armhole. My front is on my right. I have my sleeve inside out, and my front is on my right. I'm going to slip this into the armhole, wrong sides together since I'm French seaming. I'm going to line it up at the underarm seam with the sleeve seam pointing forward and the side seam pointing back, just to offset that thickness there. And then now I'm going to pin the notch at the shoulder seam. And now I give it a quick look to see if I need to drop any more of the extra fullness. But for the most part, I think we're looking pretty good. And we're going to sew this at, I'm going to sew this at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance first. And on a French seam set-in sleeve that has ease, it's okay if you get tucks in this first seam. You're gonna have to because you've drawn up all that fullness and it's hanging into the seam allowance. So all this extra here, and we can actually pull up a little bit more here. You see that little wavy edge there? At the seam line, it's not wavy at all. It's nice and taut. But right here along this edge, that's the fullness, and we are going to stitch it down and get tucks, but this isn't going to show. I always keep my thread out of the seam from the easing stitch. I have a very detailed tutorial on how to set in a set-in sleeve with a French seam if you're interested. Now we're going to trim this edge and get rid of all of these little loose threads here. And then we're going to do some ironing. Now I'm going to press this seam. And I think that this is probably the hardest part of setting in a sleeve that has easing into it when you're French seaming, is doing all the ironing. We're going to first just press this seam. It doesn't matter which direction you press it. And then we'll turn it right sides together and press it right along the seam, with the seam right on the edge there. All right, we have our armhole is pressed, and now this is the easiest step. We get to sew the final seam with the remaining seam allowance. We're going to stitch just to the left of the easing stitch if you have one. And now I just make sure that I'm not getting any tucks. This will be pretty easy to do since your line of stitching is taut. I'm always arranging the undersleeve, sort of sweeping it and making sure that it's nice and flat and it's straight across the seam. We don't want to pull it like this. We don't want it to sit like that. We want to make sure we're correcting it as we go. There we go. Let's give it a quick check. Looks good, no tucks or anything. So now we can pull out our easing stitch, which I let mine loose and it is on the right side now. So I'll just give it a little tug. And I find this helps relax it even more once it gets a little bit of a steam. Go to the inside here, pull out that thread. This is optional, it's just fun. All right, so now you're gonna repeat for your other sleeve and then we'll do our hems. Hey, it's looking like a camp shirt. All right, so now we're gonna hem our sleeves and we're gonna hem the body of the shirt. I've already pressed my sleeve hem up. You can do this, whatever seam allowance you have, however you like to do your hem. I've pressed and turned mine twice. I like the hem to fill up the inside of whatever I'm hemming, but you can also overlock the edge, turn it up, top stitch it, whatever your hem allowance allows for, and the machines you have available to you. It's time to hem our shirt. So it depends on what hem allowance you have available to you, so you can adjust if necessary and if you have a vent. So the way I'm going to do this first is I'm going to fold my facing right sides together to the front. And I'm going to sew at my full hem allowance. This is going to give you a really nice hem finish at the bottom there. So we're going to pull this all the way to the edge, right sides together. We want to make sure it's nice and straight. And I'm going to put my stitch line just on the facing and I'm going to do it at the full hem allowance. Now we're going to cut down the bulk here. We're going to cut all of the edge of this facing off except for a little bit of seam allowance between the seam and the cut edge. And we're going to cut up to, on the shirt, about 1 inch away from the body. So let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to take a big cut here, like this. I'm going to pick up just the facing, finish this cut, and then I'm going to go straight down. So now we have this little bit hanging into the facing here. Doesn't have to be perfectly straight. It's nice if it is. And now we can turn this right side out, and I'm going to fold my seam allowance here toward the facing. You can clip the corner if that's better for you. Turn it right side out. And so now we have the hem is finished straight here at center front. Now I'm going to incorporate doing my vent. And one thing I kind of love, just because it's kind of fun, is a very continuous hem. And because I'm stitching down my facing, this means I'm going to start up here at the shoulder, stitch down my facing all the way down, stitch across my hem, up and over my vent, across the back, across the front, and back up the facing on the other side. And it'll look really cool from the front because it'll look like just a continuous line of stitching. Now, if you don't want to stitch your facing down, that's totally okay. You can do a completely continuous hem across the bottom from facing to facing all the way around. So we just need to do a little bit of prep and ironing to make this successful. So the first thing I'm going to do, since I have a vent, is I'm going to press it open, a nice parallel amount here. I'm going to press my hem up here. And I'm also going to make sure that these match, unless you have a drop hem. If your back is longer than your front, then they won't match, and that's okay. So I'm going to make sure that they match just like this. And I need to decide if I want to hem and then do my vent like this, or do I want to do the vent, then hem it up, or do I want a mitered corner right there at the juncture there. Now I love the mitered corner. It is a bit fussy, and so I'm going to show that since I've never shown that before, but you can do any of these configurations that you like. So just make sure that you do a lot of nice ironing, get everything nice and level and at the hemline that it's supposed to be, and then we'll work on the details. And for this right here, just so you know how to iron this, I fold down this top edge here. I like to do it at an angle so it looks a little bit like a house. And I try and get them symmetrical to one another. And then I fold this side in like this. So it'll look something like this, both sides. I'm going for rough symmetry. I can always make it look more symmetrical with my stitching. All right, so let's do our pressing. All right, this is where we're at. I've ironed my hem up in alignment with the bottom of my facing here, that seam. And I pressed my vents, and I did this all the way around. So now you don't need to miter your corners if you don't want. You can sew your vent first, and I would go up and across and down, and then you can sew your hems. You can also start from center front here, go all the way around. But I'm going to show you how to miter the corners if you're interested in that. So now I did press all this, but then I also do this. I'm going to press this one straight up unfolded and this one straight over unfolded. And right at this intersection here where they touch, that's the miter from there to the corner. So then I'm going to fold it this way. I'm going to fold it this way and then create a little seam there. So you can see here is the seam, that diagonal line. So let's just draw it in here so we can see it. It's a straight line. And you can see that I have a fold line here, 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 and here. Now, when you go to sew this miter, you're going to fold it right sides together, stacking these two lines to one another. So you can bend it around, look for the edge there. Now the really important thing here, if you want to be able to turn under your hem twice, is you need to stop that seam right here at this fold line, the outermost fold line. That way we can still turn it under. If you go all the way to the edge, you're not going to be able to turn it under. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to stop at that outer fold. I'm going to actually start at that outer fold and go towards the corner just because of the angle of the machine here. So you can see this is still loose, right? And so now I'm just going to clip this off. And it's looking like this now. You can see I have that little loose edge, right? And now we're going to turn it right side out. And you can see how we have this loose edge. We can still turn this under like this on each side, and we'll be able to stitch continuously. Now I'm going to trim this corner here so that it doesn't need to fold inside there. So I'm just going to clip the corner off. And I'm going to do this for each of my corners here, and I'll go over it one more time. So here we have the hem folded on the full seam allowance, and I line up these two raw edges to one another, and I make a crease from there to the corner. And I'm going to open it up, and I'll draw it on here so you can see again. And we're going to fold it right sides together. I'm going to sew it from this fold here at the corner to this fold here. And then we're going to cut it off, and then I'm going to clip the corner. So this is my raw edge of my hem. And then I poke it right side out. And then we'll do our other two. All right, now we're ready to hem. So I would do another press and make sure everything is looking good. And you can see this is loose, so you can press this into the hem. All right, I've pressed everything. It looks pretty good. I made sure this was nice and flat right here, so I make sure that when I stitch this facing down, it's not going to pull anything. I've got my hems all sorted out here. And we're going to do a nice continuous stitch starting from one shoulder going to the other. Now, if you're not stitching your facing down, you can start right here at your the other end of the facing and go all the way around, across, up, over, and back to the front. All right, let's do it. Well, I'm so glad I didn't run out of bobbin thread, because that's the one thing I forgot to check. All right, that looks really good. So here we have our stitch going from shoulder seam here. You can see it right here. Next to my pocket all the way down center front. And then here we have that kind of invisible looking juncture here. Turn the corner. Up and over our vent. That looks really nice. And then all the way back to our other vent here. Center front, up to the shoulder. Very nice. Your camp shirt is done. Now you just need some buttons and buttonholes or snaps. Easy peasy. Good job. And I hope to see you in the next one. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check the description for links to some of the videos if you want dedicated tutorials for some of these skills. Happy sewing.